What would you rather your water be distilled from clouds or like coming up from the undergrounds? It's like a really interesting marketing strategy. All right, let's call this out to order. Welcome everyone to the round 1 of the HWS by Robin. Ted here will be timing. She will be providing 1 bang at 1 minute, 1 at 6 minutes, 2 at 7, and 3 at 7:15, at which point your signal that we are no longer paying attention to you, nor do we hear what you're saying. Without further ado, the motion before the House is this House will allow legislation through voter-initiated referenda. I call upon the Honorable Prime Minister to deliver the speech on the
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. This will be my first debate speech in 11 months, and you will be impressed, I promise. So what I'm going to do in this speech is I'm going to lay out Buzz&I's model, and then I'm going to give you 3 separate points about why we think this is a good idea. So basically in terms of a model, just so we get it very clearly out there. First, we're going to have some sort of petition system, right, where people can just sign on in order to get something on the table. There are things like this in place on the internet already. We're not particularly worried about it. We'd be happy to scale it as far as number of petitions based on national versus local level. That's all fine. What happens after that? After that petition has gone through, they need to find a sponsor, probably someone in the legislature, some sort of representative who will then write up that legislation, because important like, oh, gay marriage is legal now and it just happens. That doesn't make any sense. So someone's going to write it up following that petition. After that, we move to the formal referenda, and we'll do a simple 50% vote. If you get over 50%, it is then placed into law based upon the legislation that was written up by your sponsor. This is the system. So notice that the only time in which a legislature enters in is if you happen to have someone who is in the legislature as your sponsor. That's not necessarily the case. So this is clearly separate from that other system. Now I'm going to try to justify why we want this to be in place. So the first point is going to just deal with the general democratic enterprise. So we think that, by and large, the arc of history is bending towards democracy, right? Everyone is beginning to slowly adopt the ideals of a democratic system, of having a representative government, of having governments that, on the whole, have better records for doing the things that their people morally value and the things that their people think are good. Generally speaking, these governments have a better record of human rights. We think there are plenty of benefits to democracy, so we won't worry too much about defending it just as a general enterprise. But at the point where you recognize that that is a good thing, we think it's important to do it to the best extent that you can. You want to represent, whenever possible, what the particular wills of the majority of your people are. So what do we have in the status quo? We have a representative system, right? We elect someone who then goes in, works through the legislature, and tries to produce law in that way. Generally, that is sufficient. We don't want to switch to this system entirely. We think that's probably more efficient on the whole. We're happy to have that in tandem with this. But why is it important to add this additional avenue? Well, on the one hand, just philosophically speaking, why wouldn't you have this additional avenue, right? If you can find another way to express the will of your people in addition to what you already have, especially on these hard, like sticky social issues, we just think, why would you not do that? But more directly, we think that when you have certain issues that politicians are unwilling to touch, and this is an issue I'll get to later, it's just important to allow your people to more directly express their will. So for instance, in the case of gay marriage, when people aren't being represented effectively at the legislative level for a variety of reasons, it is important from a moral and philosophical standpoint as far as being consistent with the democratic enterprise to allow an additional avenue. But second, we think this adds additional legitimacy to your democratic system. So we think that if you allow people to get additional value for their vote, more so than in the case of legislature, for instance, in the case of the presidency, when your vote is largely inconsequential, especially depending upon what state you are in. If you switch to this system, where votes directly translate into concrete political change, we think that improves the chances of having people become more engaged in their system, have more confidence in the system, and feel that they are in a country which democratically represents their values. We think in the United States, for instance, The approval in Congress is something abysmal like 20%. We think you could probably get that up more if you have an additional means, such as what we're proposing. So that's just a general philosophical point. We think it's important for consistency. We think it's just an additional thing that would help. It would be an additional way. So on that level, we think it's important to embrace it. No thank you. Getting into the more concrete side of things, we want to speak to some legislative roadblocks in the second point. So I'm addressing now the problems with the legislature and why we want to bring in an alternative for those cases where it does not suffice. So first, there's just the issue of partisanship. Larry Summers can say whatever he wants, but it's really hard to get things done in a lot of democracies today that have a two-party system. The Republicans and Democrats do things like, oh, they pass healthcare eventually through, like, God knows what Obama had to have promised to get that done. But then even at that point, the Republicans in Congress constantly bring it up for an additional vote, 8, 9, 10 times, wasting taxpayer money. It's ridiculous. And they're able to do this because that's how the system works. So we think on that level, we can pass through partisanship, we can deal with things like filibusters. You can't filibuster a referenda, right? And we can help to get good laws which the people want on the whole, like the healthcare law, like gay marriage. We can get those things through without having to worry about that contentious atmosphere that is in the Senate. No, thank you. But second of all, as far as legislative roadblocks, an additional problem with the representative system is that you are beholden to the whims of that representative, right? You make your vote, and then they are in office for a certain period of time. It could be a year, it could be 4 years, it could be however many years it is in other countries. I just know the United States really. So we think when that happens, on the one hand, you're just held up to their capricious whims. You get them elected, and then for the most part, they're able to do what they want. Now, this isn't always the case. If they do something particularly outrageous, like the fellow in Wisconsin, then there can be a referendum to kick them out, which doesn't always pass anyway. But that's just if they really screw something up. There's almost nothing in there to protect the campaign promises that they make. So for instance, Obama is under a lot of fire right now for not making any concrete strides towards immigration reform. Or if he had, for instance, failed to enact any sort of legislation regarding climate change. There's very little that we can do as a democratic population to make that the case, to get the policies that we want.
For protected time.
Yeah, sure.
Alright, so if you think that the representative system is so corrupt and dysfunctional, why keep it in the first place? Why not have direct democracy?
Okay, so I talked about this, right? We think on the whole, it's good, it's useful, it's efficient, we let them take care of it, we don't have to have a referendum for everything. This is just an additional tool. They don't contradict with one another. You can have both easily. So on the one hand, just there's no protections after you get them elected. On the other hand, a lot of issues just have political poison, right? So for instance, drug law, things like gay marriage in a lot of circles, things like euthanasia, politicians don't want to touch that stuff because then they alienate significant portions of the electorate, and then they can't get reelected again. So if you take out that factor, that electoral factor, you don't have to worry about them sitting on it, you don't have to worry about them being unwilling to touch these issues. Now, the final thing I want to say is just about changing the democratic process, right? Because we're shifting from a candidate focus. We elect individuals largely on the basis of things like who they are and what they generally believe. Because no one actually knows all of the things Mitt Romney believes, not even Mitt Romney. But if we shift that to an issues focus, where instead of just electing people on a general thing, you can legislate individual policies. You can say, okay, so I like Mitt Romney's social policies, but his budget is stupid/non-existent. So you can just vote directly on that social policy that you're interested in without being beholden to that man as a package, without being beholden to his capricious whims and the political will that he has to deal with. We think this is more direct, this is more representative, it's a better representation of democratic principles, and we are happy to propose it. Thank you.
I thank the speaker for his remarks, and I'm going to lead our opposition to open the debate for the opposition bench. Here again.
Mr. Speaker, the reason why we have policies that get stalled within legislatures so often between two parties is because then they become responsible to actually according to discourse against those policies. What it means is that you get a better discussion of ideas and especially a better accountability for minorities within these particular areas. I have 3 arguments for you. The first of which is why this creates monopolies on freedoms that will actually harm minorities. And I have 3 reasons for this. First of all, when the opposition or the first government speaker tells you that now we can have areas that are going to legislate for gay marriage and for legalization of marijuana, Em and I don't think that's at all what ballot initiatives are actually, or referendums are actually going to do within these areas. What necessarily means is that a small geographic locality can decide what laws exist within their particular locality, whether that's on a state level or a more municipal level. And what those laws necessarily do is dictate the freedoms of the people inside those communities. Often you see people who are trying to create a particular social atmosphere in which they want to live by deciding the laws that will govern other people's behavior. Whether that is obscenity laws, whether that is about whether or not, whether that is about adultery should be legalized or criminalized, whether it's things like gay marriage or the right to abortion. Those are the kind of things that dictates how people's and human behavior exists within those communities and what kind of cultural or moral idea exists within those communities. And then I think it's actually an infringement for particular communities to decide by majority what laws will govern other people in this way because, first of all, the harm done to the minority versus the majority is actually on a very different scale. So what that means is in being able to create the social atmosphere that I want to think of as the most moral, where no one aborts a fetus, where no gay couple actually marries, so that I don't have to see that on the street. The actual harm that I feel by having those people exist in society with those particular freedoms is actually way less than the woman who can't have an abortion or the gay couple that can never be recognized in any formal legislature to share those rights. The actual scale of harms done to those people is different. The reason why the legislature actually accounts for that is exactly like what the first government said, where they become responsible to politicians around their country within different states according to those political beliefs. So you're talking about political consensus on a much larger geographic scale, which means you get, in general, way more different conceptions of what freedoms are because you have different people contributing to that discourse. It also means that necessarily you have politicians that are specifically accountable to those people within the localities. Because when you're a politician that's elected, you represent everybody who's in that district, even if it's not the people who voted for you. You're still supposed to be their advocate for their rights. With a ballot initiative, it is really only accountable to the people who signed that particular document. That's what we think is pernicious. It really means that you're stripping freedoms from these minorities to create a social atmosphere for a majority where the harms are being accrued to that particular group. Sure.
In the 2012 US elections, at least 3 states allowed gay marriage by referendum. Why is it necessarily the case that referenda lead to regressive policies rather than progressive?
Well, it's because in a lot of different states, we already also see indications that they're trying to subvert laws. If you look, for example, at states like Mississippi, where it's like, yes, you have the right to an abortion because the Supreme Court says so, but we're only going to have one abortion clinic available for that state by initiatives like that too. I think in a lot of states, no matter what, even if it's talking about regressive or progressive policies, you are still allowing the majority to dictate the social atmosphere of the freedoms of others without the politicians who are accountable to those people, so the harm still exists. Secondly, I also think businesses now can afford to create larger impetus for initiatives based purely on the money rather than the actual political discourse surrounding it. What that means is if you're the NRA and you want to have guns absolutely not legislated against or things like that, you can create huge amounts of money to be able to dictate that. What that means is that the debate on what is good for society and who the voices are accountable to when politicians are accountable to people, it actually means that actually the discourse now focuses on money. Thirdly, I think it creates more polarization in society because instead of having discourse that's actually centered around legality, it becomes probably more about morality or what people would like to see. So you see more examples of discourse moving from, is the fetus actually alive, towards, we just think abortion is like a terrible thing and quoting the Bible, etc., which is more polarizing within society because it means necessarily that the rhetoric is shifted towards removing badness, removing immorality, rather than discussing things on legality. What that means is that the people who are of those minorities feel way less accepted. Second argument, why this legislation probably won't even be good because it doesn't necessarily account for externalities, even if a politician crafts it. First of all, recognize that lots of policies affect different things that voters will have no idea about in ballot initiatives. We saw, for example, in Massachusetts, that PETA created a huge initiative to go against greyhound racing because on the issue of animal rights, that's terrible. What that meant was massive job loss in Massachusetts and only shifted to New Hampshire, who had actually no legislative problem with that. What it means with politicians is that when you have this debate within a legislator, you actually have more accountability for the harms, instead of PETA just being able to create an appeal based on those particular emotions through media. I'll take back.
Wouldn't the power of lobbying groups be significantly reduced because now they will not only capture 20 politicians, now they are forced to pander to millions of voters on the ground?
So the way to appeal to millions of voters is based purely upon that message that is inherently one-sided. At least when you have discussion within legislators, you have people that are, by job, supposed to represent those political opinions. Now you do have monopolies on money dictating that. I also don't think you get necessarily the kind of discussion about what the repercussions will be for the rest of society. The accountability is, of course, different. Politicians are accountable to people, organizations are accountable to themselves, the rhetoric becomes different. The last thing I want to say is that this creates discontinuous geographic zones of law, and that's pretty bad too. What that means is that laws become very much based on where that geographic area is without a larger societal consensus. What that means is that as you move from state to state or city to city, the idea of what you can do, like what age you can drink at, what is considered obscene, what you can do with your body, totally changes all the time. And that makes it, A, harder to feel part of a larger, more corporate society. So it's harder to feel like a citizen of a nation when actually your abilities within that country differ drastically from zone to zone. It means that you actually get a country of a lot of different areas. And it also means that it's a larger confusion as to what is considered right and wrong, in the sense that law is supposed to represent what's right and wrong. I think that to that extent, it's better to have more continuousness. Okay, refutation. The first argument they say is, well, democracies defend human rights. Obviously, we like this system. This is enhancement. So first of all, I actually think why democracies represent human rights in the best way is because you get all those different kinds of representation on a massive level. So the very idea that in lots of cases you have representative politics, where you have politicians represent very different ideologies, this is actually trying to subvert that political system, where you just have a majority sign their names to a particular petition. Just because you have a democracy doesn't necessarily mean you have the majority ruling, but it does mean that you necessarily create a forum for those discussion of different ideas on that representative level. And I think subverting that discourse is actually not democratic. He then talks to you about how this makes votes create concrete change and holds politicians accountable. I think that's, first of all, not true, because you could just create spurious media around those centralities. So it's actually just about appealing to the idea of greyhounds being heard, instead of all those kind of balanced measures of discussing whether or not that law is good. So even if you get more people voting, it doesn't mean that vote's more meaningful. And then you talk about partisanship, I already talked about.
I thank the speaker for his remarks, and I invite the Deputy Prime Minister to continue the debate for the government interference.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Before I get into my speech, where I'm going to talk about three major ideas, I want to just clarify one thing that I think side opposition has a complete misunderstanding of, right? So a lot of the end of their case focused on this issue of like some bizarre legal fragmentation that would launch us all into a world where we're all ruled by like hyper-micro localities, right? What we say is that that would probably not be the case. And our evidence for this is that our system is modeled pretty closely off of the way the referenda work in the United States as it stands, right? Laws still exist in the same way that they do in any municipality. We've just added another way to pass those laws, right? So to take the United States as an example, what that would mean is that if a referenda for some reason passed yet was unconstitutional, the Supreme Court would still be able to strike down such legislation, right? Because we believe those binds still exist. Similarly, right, federal law could still not be overruled by state law, right? Because that's a constitutional question, right? If that's what they're worried about, I think they have a deep misunderstanding of the way that laws generally work, because that could happen with an individual state legislature too, right? All we've done is taken the appropriate legislating power for that locality level and moved it in, and added not only a legislative component, but also a position which would allow individual people to act as legislators as well. So that said, I'm going to talk about three things. Rebuttal will be introduced. The first thing I want to talk about is democratic ideas, because they tried to like wave this off as not very important, but I think it is an important question for this round, right? What is the soul of democracy? What ought democracy shoot for, right? And what Will and I tell you is that the main idea of democracy is a perfectly clear one that we ought execute whenever possible, right? And the idea is that the people are sovereign. The people make the laws, and the laws represent the moral beliefs of a community. Now we understand, and we're perfectly fine with the fact that there are limits on that, right? Limits like constitutionality and exactly how poorly a group of people could vote to treat minorities, right? But what we say is once you control for all of that, you should, whenever possible, take out intermediaries that stand between popular will and the actual enaction of legislation. I'll take you in just 1 second, right? What Will said was that intermediaries are a necessary component of practical governance, right? There are issues with the practicality of always governing by referendum, right? But what we know is that we can identify particular cases where people feel very strongly on an issue that legislatures refuse to move on, right? In that case, not only is popular will very clear, but something else is standing in the way of popular will illegitimately. And we say that whenever possible, we ought to take away that barrier and make sure that the people's will is represented. Go ahead.
Much in the same way that legislatures refuse to move on certain topics, oftentimes, like in Colorado, they hold the referendum over and over again within a 4-year period, just waiting for the right people to show up and vote. How on earth is that democratic?
I mean, it's democratic because, like, people are being asked to vote. I mean, like, if we just had a referendum once, and everybody voted no, right, we should accept that, right? But if you can continue getting people to sign on and continue getting people to vote, is that an ideal system? Possibly not, but it's certainly better than the other system where legislatures can just stonewall and refuse to move despite massive, massive public opinion agreement on what we should do. I'll talk about a particular situation of that a little bit later in my speech. The second thing I'm going to talk about is practical problems with representative democracy, because the picture that we were painted over here is that legislatures are kind of just these wonderful gatekeepers that understand wisely what all of the good laws would be, but somehow know not to move on the bad laws. What we would tell you is that legislatures are people just like everybody else, right? And that they sometimes don't move on the correct issues and they sometimes try to pass unjust laws. So we've identified 4 particular problems that we think you need to overcome and that this policy helps you overcome, right? The first is just legislative blocking vis-a-vis lobbying or just the fact that legislatures don't want to touch particular issues. So what we would say in this circumstance is that there are reasons external to actual popular opinion, right? So lobbying firms with a ton of money who don't want a particular issue touched, right? So if you consider the issue of gun control, something like 90% of Americans support mental health checks on guns, yet we don't have action on that. Mr. Speaker, 90% of people agreeing on anything is absurd. Literally the figure is 90% of people like to eat pie, and 90% of people wish we had mental health checks. We aren't going to get mental health checks, but if we had referenda about them, we would almost certainly get mental health checks, and we say that's an important issue. The second, though, is something that Will told you about, which is the way that modern representative democracy forces you to split your identity, right? So if I vote for Mitt Romney, I might do so because I'm a fan of his social policies, but I think his economics are batshit crazy. What this means is that you have to sacrifice a part of your identity in supporting that candidate, right? Referenda allow you to overcome that barrier because you can still support a candidate who you agree with on one level, but actually make that use referenda to support other policies that you agree with, right? We say that helps overcome an important level of that, and we say that's useful for 2 reasons. So first of all, it's beneficial because it helps people pass more policies and support more policies that they agree with. But we say furthermore, that it helps people become more engaged with the political system, right? When you have to support a candidate who you don't agree with on 50% of the issues, we say that's the kind of thing that makes people turn away from politics and believe that this is all just a hopeless project that isn't ever going to represent their views, right? Referenda get people more engaged in that system, and we're very proud to be in that system. The final thing I'm going to tell you about is that there are times when Congress, even though it's acting in good faith, not being lobbied by a particular group, just misevaluates how public opinion is going, right? There are some issues where the public opinion is not perfectly clear, right? What we would say is that legislators might read that public opinion in a particularly conservative way, or in the way that they believe is less likely to get them in trouble with a particular group of constituents, right? Despite the fact that there's no maliciousness there, in cases of lobbying, right? What we would say is that this allows us to overcome, I'll take you in just 1 second, this allows us to overcome that circumstance by making sure that legislators can be made aware of what the public will is and that a law can be put on the books. Go ahead.
Politicians are supposed to be accountable to even the people who didn't vote for them, who totally disagree with their policies. Why should we shift this accountability?
Okay, so that is true in the most legalistic sense of the term, that they are not supposed to murder or take rights away from those people. But they are not obliged to represent the views of the people of the 30% who didn't vote for them, as if those were the 70% of people that did vote for them, right? That's not the way democracy works. When you lose democracy, your candidate doesn't win, you have to deal with the fact that the policies that you wanted are not going to be passed, right? So that was just a misunderstanding of democracy. The final thing I want to talk about, which clashes directly with one of the points we heard from opposing opposition, is issues of justice, right? Because I think it's important to recognize that there's no reason to believe that legislatures will be somehow always on the progressive side of legislation, right? For every case, like California's referendum against gay marriage, there are other cases of states that legalize gay marriage or legalize marijuana through referenda, right? So what that means is that we believe that you should not side with them just because you think legislatures are more likely to be progressive. If anything, we say legislatures are more likely to be on the conservative side of these policies because they're always looking to do the kinds of things that will not get them in big trouble with particular constituents, right? What we would tell you is that the people who are loudest are often going to be the people who support the status quo or the most regressive. But just because they're the loudest doesn't necessarily make them right or make them the ones that have the actual support of public opinion, Mr. Speaker. What we tell you is that our policy not only supports democratic ideals, but also it allows us to progress across society and keeps us and allows us to keep our legislators to account. We
I thank the Speaker for his remarks. I have a Deputy Leader of the Opposition to continue the debate for the Opposition head chair.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I think the conception of what kind of referendum we're talking about that we get outside government is extremely misleading. I think the presentation that they're giving you of this kind of like free discourse of ideas that's consistent with the spirit and principles of democracy is not actually how a lot of referendum works, and that's largely why Sarah and I have problems with referenda. The difference between a referenda campaign and like a discourse that goes on in a political setting is that we already, under the status quo, have lots of limits on the kinds of ways that you can influence political discourse, right? We put limits on like who you can take money from as part of your campaign. We like recognize that lobbying has a role in our government, but we're able to put limits on those kinds of things. It's not clear that in a world where you introduce substantial amounts of legislation through referenda, that you're going to have yes and no campaigns that are able to obtain the same amount of funding or public support. That leads to situations that Sarah and I talked to you about in our speech, where the rights of minorities or groups that are politically, socially, or economically disenfranchised are trod all over by like large social movements that have access to lots of funding. So I think that that's a contention that went wholly unaddressed by both speakers from First Government. I think that's a big problem. I'm going to be doing a bunch of refutation for you in this speech before I rebuild what Sarah said. I think that Sarah had a bunch of interesting points that went largely unaddressed, in particular this idea about externalities that politicians are forced to consider, like the Greyhound racing example, that like people like PETA just don't care about. Right. So what did we hear from Buzz? The first thing we got out of Buzz was that he just rejected the premise of this fragmentation that Sarah gives to you in her speech. Sarah says it's dangerous when laws, particularly like social policy, which I guess is kind of what we all agree referenda tend to deal with, vary greatly from state to state. So I actually disagree with Buzz's reading of this like kind of fragmentation in the ways in which it happens. So my understanding of like the DOMA case, for example, is if like the federal government decides that DOMA isn't okay, it still means that from state to state, in states that have gay marriage, gay people will receive federal benefits. But if you are a gay person that moves to a state that doesn't have gay marriage, there are no federal benefits for you because there is not gay marriage in that state. That creates the kind of fragmentation that Sarah and I are talking about on our side of the house. We think it's better to have continuous benefits and continuous policies so that there are clear expectations about what you as a citizen of a particular country can expect when you move across borders. That's actually what we're talking about on our side of the house. Buzz also says that the solve for this is constitutionality. And he's like, look, like if something is like a clear abuse of a minority's rights or restrictions, like they can challenge it on constitutional grounds. The kinds of groups that Sarah and I are talking to you about, particularly in conservative parts of the United States, we don't think have the resources to muster a constitutional challenge to some of these things. Or if they do eventually get the resources to muster a challenge to these constitutional issues, it might be far too late for some people. If you're that woman in Mississippi that doesn't have access to an abortion, it really sucks that we're going to have to wait 25 years for someone to mount a constitutional challenge to those laws in your states. We think politicians are directly and immediately accountable to their constituencies, and because politicians necessarily have to engage in a in an exchange of ideas on some level that isn't necessarily implicit in referenda, we end up with better outcomes, sure.
But state legislatures can do all of those horrible things too. In fact, sometimes they do those horrible things. Why is your side necessarily going to be the progressive one?
Right. Like, I actually don't think that necessarily one side, like in this debate, wins on like the progressive issue. I actually just think that because of the structures of politics and because discourse is necessarily a part of political discourse, right? Like, it is very unlikely that you're going to have a completely uniform group of representatives. There's going to be discourse on some level. You aren't guaranteed that at all in referenda. In referenda, it's completely contingent on people being able to muster the financial or social or political support for someone to mount a no campaign. I'm not comfortable waiting around to see if that campaign comes to fruition. I don't think the government should be either. Right, so this like soul of democracy, people are sovereign stuff. Sarah, I think, points out to you very interestingly in her speech, that goes unresponded to by Gov, that the rhetoric of referenda and the way that people appeal to people to get them to sign referenda is very different than the kind of rhetoric that politicians use to get people to sign, to support different kinds of legislation, right? Like if I'm PETA and want to get greyhound racing, I'm going to show you pictures of like electrified greyhounds and be like, isn't this horrific? It's very unlikely that you're going to have those kinds of extreme ideas presented to you by politicians, because the nature of politicians is that you're accountable to your constituency. If you want them to return you to office, you're unlikely, unless you come from a very specific part of the country, to appeal to that same kind of very extreme ideology. So I actually think that we have a moderating force in that respect, and that the rhetoric is significantly toned down. I also think that the consideration of externalities, which we already hinted at here, is an important consideration, right? Like, I actually think that if anyone asks, like, man on the street, like, you know, should we not torture greyhounds by forcing them to participate in an activity they don't want to? Like, yeah, it sounds like a pretty good idea. But if you're like Joe, Joe the politician who represents a district that employs like 30,000 people at a local track, Like, yeah, sure, maybe we should phase out greyhound racing, but maybe we should also create like a job stimulus in that particular region to accompany that kind of legislation. So I actually think the kinds of changes that you achieve through political discourse are much more meaningful and much better than the kinds of changes you get through referenda. Sure.
Okay, so on the issue of moderation, right? If you honestly believe that people will not be swayed by extreme images when they come from politicians, why would they be swayed by those extreme images when they come from people?
It's not that they won't be swayed by the extreme images when they come from politicians, it's just that politicians have less incentives to use those very, very extreme images. Whereas like if I was a person who's running a referendum, I don't necessarily have to present to you like my holistic worldview. You don't have to buy into all of my ideology. If I'm a politician, I'm probably going to take a more moderate stance on a number of issues that people return me to office. Like if I am the politician who only ever cares about the animals, it's very unlikely that people are going to elect me. By contrast, in a referendum, you can be a single issue person, and that's okay. So actually the discourse becomes much more extreme. We hear some stuff about legislative blocking and that there's lobbying with a ton of money and that that's detrimental to the process, but at least we know about that lobbying and we can put limits on it and we can monitor it. It's much more difficult to monitor what goes on in a referendum when people are going door to door and getting people to sign these ballot initiatives. I actually think that that is a much more detrimental kind of democracy. We hear that people have to sacrifice a part of their identity and that this allows for a broader representation because you could opt out of different parts of your candidate's platform or perspective. So I actually think the interesting part of this is that no one is running a ballot referendum on Mitt Romney's economic policy, right? People are only going to run ballot referendums on Mitt Romney's social policy because I actually just don't think the general electorate is ever going to come up with a nuanced ballot referendum that addresses economic policy. So as a result, the kinds of policies that we're getting are necessarily social ones. They're not necessarily progressive or regressive, but I actually just don't think that the kinds of tyranny of the majority that Sarah characterizes to in her speech leads to good outcomes for minorities and politicians, and good governance has an obligation to those minorities. We hear that legislatures read public opinion in a bad way. Sometimes it takes legislatures some time to catch up with public opinion, but I think the public opinion that you are measuring in referenda is actually much different, right? Because you're asking people for one part of their idea or conception on a very, very specific issue. And we hear that referenda lets people pass things like medical marijuana. It also lets people pass things like Prop 8. Prop 8 is very controversial and not necessarily a good thing at all. And I think that ultimately these referenda systems were at the local level. For all those reasons, we're very proud.
I think
Closing government will bring to you three unique points of extension. Firstly, how the existence of a referenda will remedy certain specific legislative imperfections. Secondly, how our policy will ingrain the culture of concessions and empower minority movements directly engaging with opening opposition. And finally, we will discuss the beauty of direct democracy, engaging with the point on lobbying and corruption within government itself. But before that, I have 4 points of rebuttal. Firstly, they said referenda is bad because there are different levels of harm which exist. In a way, their argument was the majority should not decide the needs of the minority. Two responses there. Firstly, that's not a reason to exclude these people from deciding. Why is it so? Because often, Mr. Speaker, these people are directly affected by policies made by legislation itself, ladies and gentlemen. Even though this policy might affect the minority, but in a way these policies still affect me as myself, whether it affects public morality or something else. But in a way, the minority will also decide what the majority wants as well. So we think that's fair in a way. But secondly, we think that argument will hurt you as well. Why is it so? Because if you look at municipal referenda, that means the people who vote are the people who are directly affected by the policy itself. For example, if you want to create a factory within that particular region, those people are the very people who are deciding, in contrast to politicians who don't even represent that particular constituency. So we think we win on the first point. But secondly, let's look at the controversial point on politicians being accountable. We think there are two reasons why accountability will be weakened under your policy. Firstly, ladies and gentlemen, the executive has 4 years to remedy the process of mistakes which they commit, Mr. Speaker. That means they have 4 years. Even if the legislation which they pass is something which is bad, they can easily remedy it because they have a long time ahead of them to remedy the process. But secondly, the executive and the legislative itself, Mr. Speaker, can employ a policy of political diversion itself. Because within the 4 years period, they can easily form other policies by giving out subsidies or other things to detract the mistake which they have committed at that point in time. This cannot happen if you put a referenda because this is a policy of direct democracy and these people do not have the ability to divert the issue in the long run. Thirdly, they said that discourse will not be premised on hate because society, because society simply cannot rationalize these kind of issues. Therefore, the discourse will be premised on hate, on simple issues. We think that's offensive because these voters, ladies and gentlemen, would want a rational assessment on this issue, especially since you look at the evolution of education. If you do recognize that these people can rationalize certain issues and can go towards the voting box to decide, we think these people will also choose to rationalize issues and will not demand hate as a point. Sit down. But finally, the argument is that, but the problem with referenda is that often you cannot master constitutional change because there's a problem in gathering support and money. That's untrue. If you look at the case analysis of Proposition 8, ladies and gentlemen, it acts as a collective body where the Rainbow Movement managed to garner money and support to bring down the movement itself. The next argument was, but this support will take a very long time. That's untrue. Again, the example of Proposition 8, it only took 6 months for constitutional reform to be made. We don't think that's a problem because the courts recognize that this is such a pertinent issue. Therefore, this will be taken into massive consideration. Now let's look at my first extension. How do we solve legislative imperfections? There are 3 sub-points of this argument. Firstly, we need to understand the context of this debate, right? Because often, ladies and gentlemen, the reason why there's a problem with legislation, because at times these are issues which are so pertinent, pressing issues which are quite new, and these are issues which aren't discussed within a politician's manifesto. I.e., maybe if I want to engage in war, it might like the consideration of war will not because it's something which is just out of a sudden, it happens at any point in time. Therefore, these politicians are not directly brought into power to discuss about this issue. That means since this is a direct, new pressing issue which is brought into power, we think we should allow the people, the people to decide because this works outside the boundary of legislative power. The example is the Patriot Act, ladies and gentlemen, which only happened after the election itself. So we think the people is best to decide. Sit down. Secondly, often politicians will employ an insidious policy of concealing controversial issues, especially when they hold the two-thirds majority. Why is it so? Because often these issues are extremely unpopular, so they won't discuss it during election period. They'll only choose to pass a swift policy during post-election itself. They might want to say, but never mind, we can hold these politicians to account during the next election. But the reason why that won't work, because these politicians, 4 years to remedy the process, can also, and at the same time, can also derail the process by giving out subsidies and other things, so that voters will forget about that issue. Before I move on, yes, sir.
You say it's offensive to say that voters won't deal with things in a rational way. Can you explain to me why voters simultaneously want all the benefits that states would provide, but are absolutely against tax raises when those are necessarily the things paying for that? Voters don't always make rational decisions.
We think voters will make rational decisions in this way, in just the same way how politicians are directly accountable to the voters who vote them into power, ladies and gentlemen. Especially when these issues are the issues which directly affect them, especially if factories are built in that way. But before I move on to the second extension, any argument from opening? Yes.
Given that the people who turn out to vote in referenda are often people that take extreme stances on either side of an issue, don't you think it's unlikely that you're going to have a moderate social discourse?
This is untrue. This nicely moves on to my second argument, how this will ingrain the culture of concession. What is culture of concession? We think there's a direct problem under status quo, where politicians can easily circumvent the process by not appealing towards the people on the ground, i.e. if there's an MNC who would like to build a factory within that particular place. What will happen under our policy? Once politicians know that they need to win the hearts and minds of the voters on the ground, that means politicians are forced to give some form of compensation towards the people, i.e. if it is an issue of land reclamation, that means politicians must pay off these people in contrast to merely circumventing the will of the people itself, Mr. Speaker. That means information will be directly given to the people and more hybrid discussion will happen on the ground. That means politicians will be forced to go on the ground and campaign and also give up some form of compensation to win the hearts and minds of the people. But finally, let's compare the argument on lobbying, because both sides agree that lobbying exists. But on policy, lobbying will be weaker now, ladies and gentlemen, because now you need to appeal towards the masses, millions of people, in contrast to only giving money towards 20 politicians, which is far more easier for corporations to do, in contrast to appealing for millions of people on the ground. So we think under policy, we directly tackle the argument on lobbying, because now it becomes much harder for these MNCs to target politicians, because now they also need to go to the people as well. Mr. Speaker, for those reasons, I'm very happy to propose.
I thank the Speaker for his remarks, and I invite the member of opposition to continue the debate to the opposition desk chair.
Mr. Speaker, I'm just going to quickly take a moment to refute what side proposition has brought before us. But before I do that, I just want to ask you two questions. Do you want lower taxes? Second, very separate question, it's not linked at all. Do you want better healthcare? Because that's what referenda do, right? They're like, here's one question, and then here's a completely separate question, without understanding necessarily that the two are linked. That's the decision that every politician has to make on a daily basis. It's not, do I want to give out better healthcare, and do I want to lower taxes? It's, are lower taxes worth better healthcare, or are higher taxes worth better healthcare? Is worse healthcare worth lower taxes? How many people are going to hate me on either side? It's not a question of these being fragmented issues. You have to look at them as a whole, and that's what voters are unable to do when they go vote once a year, if at all, in issues that may or may not affect them. Let's take a look at what side proposition brings you. On their side, they tell you that minorities will be better empowered under their system. But who actually brings forward referenda? Who has the money to campaign for referenda? Who has the money to put forward advertisements, to mobilize large groups of people to sign petitions and create social momentum around something? It's relatively moneyed groups of people that are going to be able to do that. Poor, uneducated people don't go look up how to bring up voter referenda and try and initiate that process. They're too busy working at McDonald's trying to feed their families, right? It's like relatively well-off people that have money to support their cause, that are going to be able to create the social momentum to do so, that are going to be able to bring forward referenda in the first place. And we think that that's not particularly empowering to minorities. This is why California's referenda, and frankly, most of the referenda that we've seen here are like taxes, or like, what about this really progressive social issue, right? And progressive social issues are great, but oftentimes minorities can be cut out of those issues because you're never going to get people that are undereducated or poor being able to put forward these referenda. They then tell you that voters are rational. Voters can actually cut through this process, but they don't, right? Just look at California, which bankrupts the state by doing things like voter-initiated referenda that tell it, yes, we want lower taxes, yes, we want better public services, right? It's a give and take, and they don't understand that when they look only at segmented referenda. Yes?
Okay, so it's easy enough to look at one issue and say whether or not you support that issue. It's much more difficult to spend the time and the energy when you have to work to analyze a politician's entire political package to see if you agree with all specific points.
Yeah, this is why we would leave it to politicians. This is why we would vote for a politician once every 4 years, put in that thorough analysis, right? And then let the politician whose day job it is to go ahead and make those difficult determinations. It's not most people's day jobs to sit through and analyze sophisticated political issues and go through the budget and decide exactly which items they'd like to cut, right? This is why you delegate in democracy. The purpose of delegation is that you prevent these tragedies of the commons, and that's exactly what you're allowing for here. They also finally tell you that unpopular issues don't really come up in elections, right? But I don't think you solve for that here, right? It just means that issues issues are going to be voted on by people who care about them. That may not be the people that should be voting on those issues, right? It may be that there's one particularly emotive issue for 50 people in all of the United States. But if that issue only really affects those 50 people in a big way, then maybe they're the only ones that will come out to vote, because for the others, it's not worth missing 2 hours of work to come out and go vote for this. That's why we don't have direct democracy, because we can't all go through and vote on every single issue. No. I'm going to get to my constructive, and I first want to talk to you about accountability. So everyone wants these things that, like low taxes and lots of social services, right? And segmented referenda separate these issues from another. Representatives would be responsible for these things, unlike most voters, right? Because you can look at their voting records, they'd be responsible for the ensuing mess and for bankrupting the state of California. And then you understand that these conflict and make good decisions, unlike the very same voters. So it's a different kind of fragmentation than what side first opposition talked about, because they talked to you about geographic fragmentation, but we think it's equally important. No. The second thing I want to talk to you about is information, right? Representatives, like I said, are paid to sit there and sort through these piles of information so that you don't have to. This is further complicated by the kind of language on referenda, right? Just think of how polls operate. You can get a poll to tell you a lot of very different things based on how you phrase the question. Voters don't have time to parse every single individual thing that's put forward to them to consider all of the implications that it could possibly have for different areas of the law. And as a result, they may not be able to make good decisions that actually consider these conflicts, right? Whereas politicians have to get these independent reports and actually at least pay lip service to them. They have to engage with their communities and understand what other voters actually want. It's hard to parse language, especially when someone tries to frame it in a different way. And the frank truth of the matter is that lobbyists are usually the ones that design these voter-initiated referenda, which means that they can frame the issue in any way that they want to, and people don't necessarily have to consider the implications of what they say. Yes?
But politicians also have the ability to weaken the process of accountability because they have 4 years to remedy their mistake, and they can implement policies to derail the focalizing issues upon them.
Okay, so first of all, I actually don't understand why your side wants to keep the representative system at all, right? Like, you've actually not said why you think the representative system co-aligns with this. But actually responding to your question about how politicians may or may not be accountable about this, the matter of fact is that politicians may not be perfectly accountable, but voters are even less accountable, right? Like, I literally just have no incentive as a voter not to vote for things that are personally good for me, even if they will be terrible for the community. I have no incentive to look beyond my immediate future or to consider all of these other conflicts that I may just not be able to do so as a voter, right? Just to extend a little bit more about the impact of this lack of information, you also have to consider that the people that are putting forward the referenda are the ones that get to have control over the time that they initiate the referenda, right? So if you held Obama's election 3 times in a year, you might get different results depending on the time of year it is, which social issues are in play at that time. And unlike with other bills put forward in the House of Representatives, you don't have to consider things like giving the other side time to bring up information, giving the other side funding to commission independent reports. You can just go ahead and use the money that you have in order to put forward only your side of the issue. For these reasons, and for those that my partner will summarize, this debate falls on our side.
I thank the speaker for remarks, and I invite the government with the debate, the government to chair.
Mr. Chair, I think we're really losing focus on why the purpose of this debate, right, is to really show to you what kind of democracy would be better, whether it's via a referendum or whether it's via legislation. We have to understand that even with a referendum, we're not going to go and just trample on minorities' rights like, they don't exist. We do still have laws. We do still accord them those rights. So we have to understand in this debate which then furthers the best minorities' rights and which will create a better democracy, which was completely negated on that side of the house. You're too simplistic in this debate. 3 points of contention for you in my speech. Number 1, are the harms really that great? Secondly, will this cause happen? And lastly, what what is generally better for a democracy? That's sort of the first point of contention. Are the harms really that great? Because if you notice, ladies and gentlemen, there are points of argumentation on harms who actually even still existent under their proposal, right? Number one, let's talk about the idea of polarization. They said now with the referendum, people will be polarized because now individuals would then lose. But then even in legislation, polarization would still exist because even with the passing of legislation, somebody will have to lose out and somebody will still be unhappy. So I don't see how under their proposal, legislation will be diminished, that people will be much, much happier, that no one consulted me and still passed a law in any instance. At least under our proposal, ladies and gentlemen, you do consult individuals, there are still levels of concession, and we do think that in these instances, polarization would be much less. At least under, I'll tell you later in my second point of contention, why even discourse would be much, much better under our proposal as compared to theirs. Let's go to the second idea, right, on this ridiculous idea of geographical confusion. Because apparently, according to them, now people would be really confused because there are different laws in different states, now no one will be uniform. But there's a contradiction principally under their proposal. Because if you want to fight for minority rights, you can't have uniformity at the same time, right? So we don't think under those instances, principally, they're consistent. But we need to challenge that. That happens already. Even in the status quo, you do have states that have death penalty and states that do not have death penalty, or even states that allow gay marriages and states that do not. The principle here is this. The idea here is that individuals can decide for themselves, especially when talking about the state level. Because it's what Sadiq told you, it's how it directs them, it directly affects them on an individual basis. So we don't think under those instances, the geographical confusion is very much bad. If the state feels that the age of majority should be 60, because that's what's better for them, and majority does decide it, we don't necessarily think it's a bad idea. What they need to come up and tell us, so it's probably too late. The uniformity, right, in these instances is much, much more important as compared to what the minority wanted, and this difference in confusion or difference geographically, I don't know what they really wanted. So never really challenged, or never really explained under that point. Sit down. Let's go to the idea of discourse. Because they never showed to you on how better discourse would happen. Because obviously, even if you're going to give a referendum, we need to have discourse. We need to ensure that individuals are well informed enough to make a decision to pass that referendum. They talked about moderation and discourse. They never told us why there is a difference between discourse in campaigns and difference when it comes to politicians. Because they say, oh, it's really extreme. But we challenge that. Are people really that uninformed or really that ridiculous to not decide things for themselves if they can already decide the politician that they want to vote for? Sit down. We also would like to challenge at the second level, how much different are they? How really extreme can it be? But even if it was extreme, that's not an argument to not allow referendum. That's probably an argument to regulate the kind of extremity that you would like to have. So probably a more moderate idea, then we think that's completely fine. Thirdly, but that happens already. Like politicians slander each other all the time, and especially when it's close to elections. Having campaigns, having advertising, outrightly slandering each another individual to allow themselves to win. So we don't think extremity would actually not necessarily exist. It will still happen. Look at what Al Gore did, right? He scared the bejesus out of everybody with climate change. We still think that extremities would still happen. Discourse would happen better under our proposal. Why? Because there is no relation to partisanship at all. You are genuinely just fighting for the cause on the ground. You are genuinely fighting for the cause that affects people at the very end. They talked about here money. Now individuals, now it's really about money, and nobody has the ability to fund. Hello, you have NGOs, you have organizations like now, you have organizations that's about the rainbow movement, right? To ensure that individuals can pass these proposals. And if it is a proposal or a referendum that is pertinent to the society and it's really that important, we think sponsors are not a problem, especially considering that sponsors even already exist under our proposal. How will concessions happen under our proposal? Because especially when talking about referendum, it's still a bit more flexible compared to legislation, because individuals then can concede and talk to each other a bit more before the referendum is passed, and can change the referendum and can change the laws, which is not acceptable, probably not existent within a legislation. Before I move on, closing.
Okay. If people were honestly as informed as you say they are, we would have no need for politicians, because it takes a lot of time and a lot of effort to actually inform yourself on a wide spectrum of issues. People are just not going to be as informed as you say they are.
Look, okay, first things first, right? Even under their proposal, they're supporting uninformed individuals. But at least under our proposal, one issue comes up at a time. It's not like a whole bunch of issues that will come up, and individuals will have to vote on a few things at one go. We think that when each issue comes up, individuals have have the ability, if it feels that it is important to them, like if gay marriage really is important to me, or if the environment is really important to me, then these individuals will take the time and will take the initiative to find out these instances and will vote on a referendum. Because people who don't care, ladies and gentlemen, will not be affected at all because they don't come up to vote. Same thing is how politicians or how elections work in the very first place. If they don't care, they won't vote at all. So the individuals that do matter, they will pick it up. Yeah, sure.
In California and Colorado, there were 10 different referenda on the ballots. The idea that you're only analyzing one issue in an election is completely ridiculous. You actually have a bunch which only certain people will vote.
Okay, fine. Let's accept that, right? Let's go to the third point of contention in this debate. What's better for a democracy? Because we have to talk about generally the kinds of issues that we're talking about, right? Because apparently, according to them, now each and every individual will come up with so many different things and be really confusing. Like, for example, better social services. I don't know how that's a legislation to begin with. I think that's just generally what politicians should do, than just give better social services, right? But we're talking to you about, especially when it comes to things such as taxes. Now, because individuals don't really understand the complexity of things. Ladies and gentlemen, like they will sway issues and it's really bad and then they don't understand. But they do the same things even with partisanship, right? They support the Republicans because they want lower taxes. Oh, sorry, lower taxes. But they support the Democrats because they want higher taxes. I mean, I don't really see the difference because these people would still want to engage in these sorts of things, even though, despite the fact whether they know or not the effects of taxes from the very beginning. But what's the difference under our proposal, right? Because the proposals that we are talking to you about things such as social issues, for example, especially talking about social issues, acceptance is needed within these instances, and we think that via a referendum, acceptance is already there. And we think that this is the best way to allow minorities to come up, concessions to come up. We don't think under their proposal, especially with the tendency that these guys never really negated what Sadiq talked to you about. We think that a better democracy is under our proposal because individuals are much better represented and the voices are much better heard as compared to just legislation that were very bad proposals.
Here. I thank the speaker for remarks, and I invite the opposition witness to close out today's debate. Here.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. One of the main problems me and Bhuvana have with Westminster parliamentary systems is that oftentimes the people in government get to decide when an election is held. They get to dictate the terms on which something is actually decided, they get to decide when exactly that election happens, and they can do far more planning than opposition groups ever necessarily could. One of the arguments that Bhuvana gives you that I think is quite important, and I don't think ever gets responded to, is quite a practical issue that puts referenda into question in many ways. Which is, when you are the group that gets to determine when a referenda is put on the stand, when you can basically decide that this person is going to sponsor this now, and the opposition group has absolutely no ability to determine whether or not that is going to happen, you are necessarily at a parity of power, which makes referenda far more likely to succeed. You see this in more referenda succeeding than don't succeed. But the other problem with these referenda is that you can just hold them over and over and over again until the right people show up. I think these are both problems that really are never addressed and were big parts of our extension of surprise. But I want to talk about two things. I'm going to talk about the impacts on citizens and the impacts on the democratic process as a whole. I think both are quite important. So first starts off this round by telling you that in many of these groups that minorities are going to necessarily be put at a disadvantage because majorities are going to be able to take rights away, they're going to be able to do things that they wouldn't otherwise be able to do that's much harder in a legislative process. Gov responds by saying, just as often as rights are taken away, we also grant them. But the problem, and what I think they miss here, is that it makes things much easier to do as a necessity, right? With a 50% requirement, it is much easier to, for instance, grant someone the right to marriage or take it away than it would be able to do in a legislative process. I don't think it's reasonable that for these people who have to live the rest of their lives with these sorts of consequences, that you would take these sorts of things away. I don't think it's reasonable to simply have a 50% vote and no turnout requirement at all. You could have 0.3% of the population vote and decide that no one has gay marriage anymore. I think that is ludicrous, right? And these groups actually have an incentive to ensure that there isn't turnout, because they only want the people that they know are going to vote in favor to come out, and because they've been the ones planning for this entire time to have a referenda, they have far more more power to be able to ensure that these things happen. That necessarily means that the things that Emma and Sarah talked to you about minorities being disadvantaged, happen because these things take place. I think we give you impacts for why that actually happens. Go ahead.
The other side of that is that minorities that are already disadvantaged by legislatures stay disadvantaged for far longer under their system. You can't have your cake and eat it too.
No, because the thing that the legislature protects is that there are rights that the legislature can't overturn without a massive amount of people, right? In, for instance, the American system, the reason that they talk about logjam, but they talk about this as a necessarily negative thing. Logjam in many places, in many instances, prevents politicians from taking actions that aren't actually universally popular. For instance, if you don't have a 60% requirement in the US Senate, you aren't able to take other actions. I think that makes sure that many of these things are more popular. I don't really know that that applies to this round. But a then first government tells you that we should actually try to ensure that democratic process is as pure as possible, that representative democracy is fine, but we also need to have this to ensure that we have a mechanism by which we can allow people to vote on certain things, and they give you a couple reasons to believe this. They first mention that people often vote for candidates that are a compromise, right? You might agree with Mitt Romney's social policy, but not agree with his economics. They then say that a lot of issues are marginalized and people don't want to actually talk about those issues, and there's a lot of political problems with them. The last thing that they say is that the legislative process is bad. I have responses to all of these tiers of argumentation. First of all, the reason that that you have to compromise on a candidate between certain views is like the necessary process of the representative system, right? Candidates have to compromise on things all the time. Candidates have to compromise on the idea of having a great new social program and also the costs that might be interpreted therein. People like us, much like in debate, don't have to give a shit about the costs of something, right? No one will ever mention that. When you can put on a ballot referenda that you want policy X, I think that you can necessarily determine the discussion that comes about as a result of that policy, and people aren't going to, as second government would have you believe, talk about these issues in huge depth, because frankly these referendums happen too quickly, they happen too often, and I don't think that that actually ends up happening. But also, a lot of the things that they call damaging, I'll take you now back up, go ahead.
Would the concessions be made better on our policy, because now these politicians and corporations must win the hearts and minds of the people on the ground, therefore paying compensation and trying their best to win these people's votes?
But one of your own arguments contradicts this, because you say that only the people that are impacted by policies are going to actually vote on things. That means that the only incentive you have to reach out to anyone is to reach out to the people that agree with you. You don't have to change the hearts and minds of everyone, just of the people on a specific issue that you might agree with. If only women vote on abortion policies, I don't think that's necessarily a good thing. I think that society should all be involved in changing these policies because they have wider impacts. I don't think it's good to have people just voting on these specific tiers. But I think that the other thing that we would tell you is that that citizens don't have to worry about these things, and we want to tell you this, I think quite rightly, citizens don't have to worry about the same things that politicians do. I think that under their system, what incentive does a representative have to ever compromise on a bill and come up with a comprehensive reason to solve something? Why wouldn't they just sponsor a referendum and try to achieve it through that mechanism? I suggest to you that you are only going to have the two extremes of an issue ever battling at one time and never have any compromised positions like the Gang of Eight or any of the multiple different times when politicians have gotten together and tried to solve something. When you can just initiate referenda over and over again, I think that never happens. So let's talk about impacts on democracy as well. So first of all, I suggest to you that this turnout thing is necessarily bad because you have no requirement for what these people actually have to do to ensure that something is binding. The idea that you could have 1% of a country or a province or a state's people come out to vote on something as binding as same-sex marriage, to me is ludicrous and frankly horrifying, especially when you can just hold that referendum every 4 months to get the right result. I think that's completely ridiculous. But I'd also suggest to you that planning and mobilization necessarily monopolize things on behalf of the wealthy. Because if someone in a minority group, like they suggest, like NOW or an NGO, starts a referenda, they don't actually get that much benefit from planning beforehand because they don't have the same capital as a corporation. This is why these minority groups end up often losing their referendum. But if you have the massive wealth of a corporation or of these other groups like the NRA, you have much more ability to actually use this wealth to convince people. I think that's incredibly important. They try to suggest to you that lobbying is actually harder on on their side of the house because you have to pay all these different people. But that's actually ludicrous. What you end up doing is you pay specific people to engage with the people you think might vote. In many of these referenda, they actually do they try to discourage certain types of votes and ensure that those people don't come out. That is necessarily not having the right outcomes. We are very proud of those.
I thank the speaker for his remarks. Congratulations for that. Thank all of the speakers for their remarks, and make sure you shake hands and then step out of the room and attack the hearing.